Hello and welcome to Note Doctors. My name is Paul.
My name is Jen.
My name is Ben.
And we are your hosts. We are all university music theory instructors who are passionate about music theory and music theory instruction. In this podcast, we will be talking about all things theory with some of the best music theory teachers in the country. If you want to know more about music theory and the most effective and innovative ways to teach it, this is the podcast for you. Hello and welcome back to Note Doctors, Music Theory and Pedagogy Podcast. Welcome to Season 4. Woo! I cannot believe that we have made it through 3 whole seasons and are about to embark on our 4th season of Note Doctors. So thank you, listeners who have been listening to us all this time, or maybe just recently found us on the internet. But we have a wonderful episode to kick off our season with none other than Dr. Nancy Rogers. So if you want some inspiration for your Aural Skills class, you have come to the right place because she's dropping sight-singing truth bombs all over the place. It's just a great time. But before we get into the conversation, let's learn a little bit more about Dr. Rogers.
Absolutely. So Nancy Rogers, professor of music theory at Florida State University, has been honored with both graduate and undergraduate teaching awards, with research interests focusing particularly on music cognition and its pedagogical implications. She has presented papers at numerous national, international, and regional conferences. She is co-author of Music for Sight Singing and the corresponding rhythm generator software. Other publications have appeared in Routledge Companion to Music Theory Pedagogy, Music Theory Online, Applied Cognitive Psychology, the Journal of Music Theory Pedagogy, and Integral. She has served as Vice President and Secretary of the Society for Music Theory, President of Music Theory Southeast, in leadership positions with the Advanced Placement Program in Music Theory, and is currently on the editorial board of the Journal of Music Theory Pedagogy. And we had an incredible talk today. It was really fun.
As I often say to my students when we get there, we're not resolving this way because I say so or because our textbook says so. We're doing it because your ears say so. That's why you did it that way. And you all agreed on this. This has got to be a real thing. And to be clear, although my focus in my courses is classical music, it's certainly not restricted to classical music. I'm totally sure you play a pretty formulaic pop song and stop it a little bit before the chorus and ask your students what's going to come next. They know it's the chorus, and they can tell you when it's going to start, right? It's going to be right about here. Now, of course, we all know that sometimes common patterns are broken. Maybe the chorus arrives a measure late and keeps us hanging on in anticipation, or maybe there's a deceptive cadence instead of an authentic cadence. Things happen, but it's fun to be tricked now and then, and we can't enjoy that if we don't have expectations. There's literally no such thing as a surprise for somebody who has no sense of what would come next.
So Nancy, we are so happy to have you on the podcast to talk about all things sight singing and aural skills. We're thrilled to have you on. Before, though, we get into our conversation, though, we do like to ask our guests just a little bit about how they got into music theory. Did you always hope to be one half of a dynamic music duo like Casca Payne, Lennon McCartney, Hall & Oates, Rogers Ottman? Was that always part of the dream?
No, music theory was not part of the plan at all. I'd say this is going to be a little bit of a weird story, but how I first started doing a little music theory unwittingly, and then I'll get into when I kind of realized I was doing it. My family moved a couple of times when I was relatively young, around 12-ish. Because my mother was getting a degree. The background there doesn't matter, but the point is I moved from Pennsylvania to Seattle. And when I got to Seattle, I was playing in the band that they sort of randomly put me in because, I'm a total stranger. They don't know if I'm any good. And so they just, dropped me in a band. And I was playing percussion because, it doesn't matter. I was playing percussion, and they needed somebody to read the bells part. I played piano for years. Sure, I can read a bells part. And, conductors get all excited when you have a percussionist that can read music, right? At that age. Yeah, so the director, pretty shortly after seeing that, he said, would you like to play, can you read music that has things like this? And he showed me a lead sheet where, all I'm looking at is seeing like, okay, capital C, and then, like lowercase d and that sort of thing. And I just sort of like, was that saying C major and D minor? Like, well, yeah, sure, I can read that. Not knowing what that really meant. Just like, well, yeah, I mean, I know my major and minor triads, okay, but I just said, sure, I can read that. And he says, you want to play with the stage band. Now, I had come from a rural area of Pennsylvania. I did not know what a stage band was. Jazz band I would have recognized, but I didn't know stage band. So I thought, well, it's a band that plays on a stage. Sure, I can do that. So I said, well, be here at 7:30 tomorrow morning. Like, okay. And so I get seated at the piano, and this music put in front of me that is like, okay, all these various letters, and then they start playing. I'm like, oh, this is jazz. I don't play jazz, but this nice man asked me to do this. Like, I got to figure something out. So, at first we're like, well, okay, I can do the capital C and the lower D. It's like, but of course it sounds like garbage in that music. Like that is just stylistically inappropriate. So, and one of the funny aspects is that I would see things like, which of course now I'd read as an A sharp diminished chord, right? But I don't know what that symbol is, and so I just called them, in my mind, I thought those are the zero chords. Okay, it's the zero chord. So an A sharp zero chord means, well, play an A major chord, but take that bottom note up a half step. I mean, it's this long translation process. So I was between that and like, well, if I just listen, I can come up with something. And I began to realize that, like, when there were solo sections, that it really tickled him pink if he or somebody would play something and I would play it back, as just part of the going along. And, he obviously enjoyed that. So, of course, I did it more. And, I don't know I'm practicing aural skills, and I don't know what the zero chords are, and, what do I know about anything? But just really trying to fit in and make some sense of this, I would say was my first dose of music theory. I just had no idea. I just got to sort of read what some of these symbols are. So I took an actual music theory class in high school, and I enjoyed it in the way that I enjoy doing like Ken or Sudoku or things like this. They were really fun puzzles. So, I mean, I enjoyed it, but it was not something that, like, you don't make a career playing Ken. I mean, that's insane. So, but, again, it shows, I think a lot of people go to school, a lot of musicians, and I'm definitely one of them, go to school without even having the foggiest idea what music theory is. There's things you can do, sort of the parlor tricks of music theory, right? But, music theory is an activity, an analysis as a serious activity, no concept. So really fun, but, clearly not a serious career, right? So I went to college as a music major, went to Northwestern, and I went in expecting to major in saxophone and philosophy. They had a 5-year BA, BM program, and I thought that sounded great. But my very first semester there, my freshman theory class was taught by John Bucheri, who I mentioned at the workshops in Vancouver as, whether he knew it or not at the time, getting me into music theory, because he would come in every morning and I'd think, this is so interesting. I know this stuff. I have learned this stuff in high school, but not like this, not in this way. And why is everything he says and does just so interesting? It's just taking all these things together and doing something really cool with it. And so I still wasn't thinking of myself as being a music theorist, but it's just like, wow, there's more to it. This is really, really neat. And he would say these little offhand remarks about, well, part of what I love about being a music theorist is that, as a pianist, I learn music really deeply through playing it. I know it in a certain way, more than, just I would casually. But there is music that I can't play, either because it's too difficult for me at the piano or because it's, violin music and I cannot play it. But as a music theorist, I can get to know it in that same kind of deep way, even though I personally cannot play it. And there's things like that you go, well, that's really interesting. So to sort of zoom ahead on this, I was just really interested in this just as a field, and at some point I began to, thank goodness, get smart and think, wow, I actually really enjoy doing my theory homework and looking at music and thinking about music and helping people who drop by my dorm room with their homework and learning stuff like this. To be clear, not doing their homework for them. People learned if they wanted answers, don't even bother, but if you want to get like really, really drilled on information. Yeah, come by. I was enjoying that so much more than I was like being in a practice room with my instrument. And, to top it all off, because I know being in a practice room is almost nobody's favorite thing, but I actually don't enjoy performing music. I like playing music. I love thinking about music, but I do not actually enjoy being on stage and performing music. And so, like, what am I thinking? So, fortunately, around my junior year, I suddenly thought, like, really, I should be thinking about teaching music theory. This is where I have the most fun. And so, I came out of Northwestern with degrees in music theory, composition, and linguistics. And so didn't see that coming, but when I started teaching classes in grad school as a TA, that really confirmed I'd made the right choice, because for me, teaching is it's fun and it's interesting, and I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. So it was really never part of the plan to do that, but once I latched on, or it latched on to me, I don't know which, that's what I've just really wanted to do. I feel so lucky to do it, honestly.
Yeah, same.
So you're an author of one of the main sight singing texts used at the collegiate level, Music for Sight Singing. Now it's in its 10th edition. Just curious, when did you begin to work with Robert Ottman on this text? Because if I remember right, this was a text that he had kind of curated for many years. And so how did you get kind of started with that? And what's the kind of process like of curating such a large collection? And maybe it might be helpful for our listeners who aren't familiar with this text to maybe explain kind of how it's put together in the first place.
Yeah, Ottman started this book before I was even born, and so it was the first book that was arranged in the way that it is, that with a harmonic focus, and having the melodies be ordered in a really coherent way of, leaps from the tonic triad, leaps from the dominant triad, and it was really groundbreaking in that way. And it started off as a small book and grew up, and so I have enormous respect for Robert Ottman. Now, part of the answer for your question is I never worked with Ottman at all. Because it's another weird story, so pardon me if I ramble on too long, but here's what happened. When Ottman was, I guess, in his early 90s, he decided he was really getting too old to continue with this sort of work. It was just taking a lot out of him, I guess, and so he was interested in finding somebody who would come on as a co-author. I didn't know this at all. What I know from my perspective is I'd just been teaching a pedagogy of theory class, and I came back and my office phone was ringing. Walk in, answer the phone, and it is somebody from what was then Prentice Hall, later became Pearson, editor there, who said, we're thinking about coming out with a new edition of, are you familiar with the Ottman Music for Sight Singing book? And I said, yeah, I know it well. And he goes, well, we're thinking about coming up with a new edition, and I was wondering whether you might have some suggestions for it. And I can call you back tomorrow or something if you want to have a chance to, refamiliarize yourself with the book. I said, no, I know it well. And so, well, you can talk now. Like, yeah, sure. So we talked for a long time, like 45 minutes or so. Mm-hmm. And I talked about sort of the ideas of what I thought would be really good in the book and that kind of thing. And at the end of it, this editor, it seemed really weird to me. He said, can you do me a favor and write that down in an email and send it to me? And I'm thinking, man, were you not taking notes? I mean, geez. But I thought, it's an important book. It's a major publisher. I would love to see the book get better and, and I should say even better. Again, high respect for Robert Ottman. So I wrote it up in an email, sent it off, didn't think anything about it until like 2 days later, when the guy calls me again in my office. He goes, I got some follow-up questions for the stuff that you wrote to me. I'm like, okay, shoot. And I mean, we talked for like an hour and a half. It was this long conversation. And by golly, at the end of this, he again says, could you write that up in an email and send it to me? I'm like, man, what is up with this guy? But like, yeah, it's an important book. Sure. I sent it in. And the next week, phone rings again, same guy, and I'm thinking, all right, I'm putting my foot down this time.
Get a stenographer right now.
Are you taking notes?
Exactly. I was about to say that, and he said, look, I got a confession to make. Robert Ottman is looking for a co-author for this book, and we've just been calling a number of people who were recommended, and I've really been liking your answers, and so, I would like you to actually apply for becoming co-author of this book. Write us up a proposal of what you would do. And by this point, my heart is just like pounding, like you have got to be kidding me. So I've got absolutely no idea how many people got talked to. I don't want to know. But this was like right before Thanksgiving break, and I said, when do you need this? And he said, well, if we got it sometime by the end of December, that'd be fine. Like, sure, I can definitely do that. So but it's all I could think about. So over Thanksgiving break, there I was at my in-laws' house, and I was, trying to be a decent guest, but my mind is just like, what would I do with this sight singing book? And, so I wrote up this proposal, and at some point, I think I sent it out, maybe the Monday after Thanksgiving break, because I realized, like, if I don't just send this in, I'm going to keep fiddling away with this for the entire rest of the semester, and my life will be gone, So I just sent it in, like, you've got to take this out of my hands, and, here's my ideas. And, he called me back at some point and said, Ottman really liked what you had to say, and the whole staff here liked what you had to say, and so we'd like to offer you the position. The one thing that was peculiar about this was that the main thing I was pushing, well, the two things I was pushing was expanding the rhythm, and that I really wanted to add structured improvisation exercises. And the editor said that their favorite thing about this was the structured improvisation, and that all the reviewers they sent my proposal to, again, whoever they were, thank you, but that was their favorite thing also. But that Ottman himself had the reaction of, well, really, that would go with a written theory class. That's got nothing to do with sight singing. Now, I, of course, don't agree. And he said, look, the rest of us don't agree either. Don't worry. I know him. I will talk him into it. Like, okay, fine. So he, told me to dive in, get to work, and work on this stuff, and start with the structured improvisation. Like, okay. So, I worked, and then I would, periodically talk to the editor and say, have you talked to Ottman about this? Because you promised you would. He goes, it hasn't come up, but don't worry, I'll take care of it. And, there was a point at which I don't know how many hours I had devoted to this, hundreds of hours, and the stakes were starting to feel pretty high. And I, like, have you talked to him? Like, don't worry, it's going to be absolutely fine. And I can't stress, I have enough that I have plenty of respect, so much respect for Bob Ottman. But so please take this in the spirit intended. What I've told a number of people is that Bob Ottman essentially said, she will add those structured improvisation exercises over my dead body, and then he made it happen. Because the editor had never broken the news to him when, unfortunately, he went into the hospital and died. And so I never met the man. He wrote me one little card saying, I've got some ideas for the next edition. And that's all it said. Signed it. I don't know what those ideas were. I've got no idea. Nothing. I never met him. I never had a class with him. We have no association other than this book. And so, I mean, he's done the world this huge favor, and it's a great honor to pick up his work and try to keep the book alive and well in his memory. But I never worked with him at all.
Wow.
I know, it's a weird story. I know.
That just blows my mind. It's like watching like a behind the music show or something, like where you find out how this actually happened. And Jen, did you know? Ben, did you know?
No, I had no idea.
Wow. I just assumed that you at least had some type of working relationship.
Yeah.
That is so fascinating.
People always said, okay, so you went to North Texas. Like, no, I did not. Well, then how did you know Bob Ottman? I did not. You cannot explain what happened in a short version of the story. Like, nope, no association. I just like came in and took over. Like that's all wrong also. So it's just a peculiar thing.
Well, it sounds like your patience with this editor who, apparently was not taking good notes on purpose paid off in the end.
Yeah, well, let's assume he was taking notes. He just,
Probably.
wanted something written to show people. But yeah, and I
Right.
mean, in retrospect, of course, I'm actually really grateful. I would have been overwhelmed if this idea had been rolled out first thing, and I might even have like withdrawn myself from considerations. I am but a lowly assistant professor, and what do I know compared to plenty of people with a lot more experience. But yeah, doing it that way in retrospect was really, really kind. So I appreciate that. As weird as it was, and of course I've gotten a great story out of it. So
It's true.
Well, as someone who's used the structured improvisations in their class from your book, I want to thank you for insisting to keep those in there because I think
thank
they're
you.
great. I think they are accessible and give students enough, structure, right, to feel confident in, improvising in little, few measured chunks or things like that. I love it.
it just seems to me that, especially for a sight singing book, where the organizing principle right from the start was harmony, that it made complete sense that, well, if you're thinking about leaps within the tonic triad or the dominant seventh chord or what have you, then it's so much easier if you actually have the sound of the dominant seventh chord in your head. I mean, what I often say to my students is, because I can demonstrate that if I play accompaniment with them, that, oh, the leaps are so easy when you actually hear that dominant seventh chord. Like, well, yeah, but you can have the accompaniment of your mind. If you can imagine that dominant seventh chord, it's the same phenomenon. And so that is simply approach. So this is just a way to get people thinking harmonically and actively. So I see this as not truly a new element to the book. It's just a different way of approaching the same element that's attuned to the book's whole organization.
So how has the book changed and grown across the 10 editions, or since you've been on board? I looked back at old edition covers and I was trying to figure out which one was your first one, and I couldn't figure it out.
Seventh edition.
Okay.
Yeah. The two most obvious changes are what I mentioned earlier, that the addition of the structured improvisation exercises and the significant expansion of the rhythm exercises. I thought that was kind of a weak point, and a lot of people at that time were using a separate rhythm book because you really need to supplement it, and maybe they still are, but I hope that there's less need to it. Anyway, so I've added excerpts that focus on characteristic bass lines rather than melodies, because bass lines are different. They aren't just melodies that happen to be in the low register. And I was especially concerned with the different leaps that we frequently encounter in bass lines, and the stylistic differences in the way that leaps are used when it's a bass line as opposed to a regular melody. So that's why I wanted to add in a bass line section. I added more excerpts that contain somewhat difficult features like seventh leaps or an arpeggiation of the Neapolitan. I added a section for arpeggiating augmented sixth chords, which are not easy to find. And there's also changes that are probably a lot less obvious at a glance, like shifting triplets and syncopation earlier, before chromaticism. And this may just be as a response to students I have had, but they have tended to be stronger at rhythm, and I felt like the rhythm was too easy compared to the pitch for them. So I moved that earlier, and at least now you have more options. I also subdivided some topics that can be challenging that were being introduced more or less kind of at once. So, for instance, chromaticism is now introduced in an entirely stepwise context. So, like chromatic neighbors or chromatic passing tones first before there's any leaps involved. Minor keys too. The hard thing about minor keys is scale degrees 6 and 7. Scale degree 3 is not that bad. So I've got early melodies where it's just scale degrees 1 through 5, and then where 7 is always raised leading tone going to tonic, and it's the low form of 6 going to 5. So just the way you expect 6 and 7 usually to behave in their standard context. Then I branch out to the less familiar raised form of 6 and the low, the subtonic form of 7, but again, doing what they normally do, and then finally onto things where they're maybe not doing what you most expect. So, for instance, if you have something that goes 5, 6, 7, 6, 5, so sole, tele, so we're like, oh, well, that's really an upper neighbor to the 6. You can take a big picture thing, but so I anyway organized the minor keys in that more sort of systematic baby step kind of way. let's see, I added a section that was specifically targeting modulation from a minor key to its relative major, because the shift of tonic is so much easier for a lot of students to hear in that context. Plus, there isn't going to be a whole lot of debate about whether it was a modulation or maybe just a tonicization, the way you would get if you were having a modulation to the dominant of a major key. Oh, which is also why I've got more exercises that modulate in a minor key to the minor dominant, because that also avoids that kind of ambiguity. Not that there's anything wrong with ambiguity, but that's not always, when you're trying to introduce modulation, you don't want people to like, well, I can still get by not shifting the syllables. I want them to have that reaction of like, this makes no sense until I shift the syllables. I mean, except for people doing law-based minor, that's a whole different deal. But, again, they've got the mix. More generally, I've tried to make sure that after topics are introduced that they keep returning in later chapters, because like if C clefs are only found in one chapter all concentrated, for instance, I kind of think that's a problem. So, I've increased the number of melodies in minor keys, in bass clefs and C clefs, in keys with a relatively large number of sharps and flats. And included more music by living composers, things like that. And last but not least, there's the rhythm generator. If you don't know that, it is free online software, free, really, truly free, online software that generates rhythms that are appropriate for any chapter of the book. And you can select various features like the length, the difficulty, whether the meter is simple or compound. And then you can just keep on asking for new rhythm, as long as you want, or switch your features or whatever. My friend Bill Wieland, who teaches at Northern State University in South Dakota, did the programming. He had done a little of this on his own and said, hey, do you like this? Just wanted to show you, like, I love this. Let's see if we can expand it. So he did the programming, and I basically came up with the recipes that assemble rhythms from the stock of patterns that are available in any given chapter, so that the rhythms are, it's technically not an infinite number of rhythms, but because there's only so many permutations that are possible, but it is a very large number of rhythms that can be generated with this. And but if you do them randomly, it doesn't sound like music. So like I said, I think of them as recipes of, once you have done this, if you're going to look for say an 8-measure pattern, chances are measures 1 and measures 5 kind of match, or at least have very motivically similar things. So I started thinking about ways that would make it feel like it was creating phrases, and there's ways that like syncopation can and can't happen, or suddenly you're accidentally veering into things like hemiola that you didn't intend to. So it was just a matter of picking constraints of I think it's kind of like a whole lot of paths, basically, that once you've done this, here are your options, and from any one of these, here are your options. And I'm realizing I'm waving my hands around like this makes any sense on a podcast. Sorry. Just picture that at any given point along the way, you say, well, given what's come before me, here are the options that make musical sense, and we generate patterns from there. So that's the gist there.
Well, and being able to remember and identify patterns that you've done before is a musical skill that we want students to develop, right?
Absolutely.
So sure. I think that's super important. Now, I am curious how the process has been in finding musical examples, because your text is not a text where you can just compose, the examples. Oh, I need something that goes, 5 flat 6 flat 7. You have to go find a piece of music that has that in there. So how challenging is that? And kind of the follow-up would be, what is the benefit of using those kind of real life musical examples rather than just writing them out, composing new ones?
Yeah, it is really hard to do it that way. It is always funny to me when I have my pedagogy students look at a variety of sight singing books, and I ask them questions that are kind of along those lines about, what do you see as the benefits of pre-existing music versus newly composed music for the book? And they often sort of misinterpret the question. They say, oh, well, it's so much harder if you have to compose all these melodies as opposed to just finding them because they're out there. Like, oh, you have no idea. No.
It's definitely the other way around.
Yeah, it is very much. Yeah, I could write tons of melodies. Would they be as good? I'm not saying that, but yeah, it's a lot easier to write things, especially when you're looking for particular features. So yeah, I will comb through books, and yeah, it's it's hundreds of hours that can go into finding particular things. So a lot of what I'm doing, when the publisher wants a new edition and I haven't managed to find something that I'm looking for, then I start targeting and start thinking sometimes I get lucky and stumble across things. Like, for instance, I was aware that the modal chapter tended, not surprisingly, to have a lot more Dorian and Aeolian melodies, and maybe the occasional Mixolydian, but there's not like a lot of Lydian melodies out there in most of our familiar contexts. Well, I start thinking what are some sources for these? And folk melodies is a good way to find modes. And so I stumbled across in this search for folk music that maybe would have some modal things. The country of Iceland. I guess because it's that's a very unique kind of cultural situation.
We do that chapter, so I know there's all these Iceland melodies.
Yeah, well, here's what happened. I think because they've been so isolated, they've got a real interest in their own history, and they're so well documented. Because I guess that they can go through because genealogists use them too because they know their heritage. They're so isolated. They know these things. So they have a lot of cultural sort of projects. Like, here's an enormous collection of our folk songs. And I thought, well, what the heck? It's a big online collection of the folk songs. And I sure don't know Icelandic music. That'll be different. Turns out there's a lot of Lydian Icelandic melodies. That's really, so when I need more Lydian music, well, that's good. And there's also a fair amount of Phrygian. Well, I could use that too. So yeah, there are things like that where once you stumble across it, okay, that's fine. It's really much the way that if you're asking somebody where could I find a good rounded binary, and you say, well, look at the inner movements of classical music, right?
Right.
You begin to learn places you can look for particular things. But a lot of what I do during the sort of between the editions thing, when I'm not actively working on it, if I happen to be at a concert or listening to a recording or whatever, and I suddenly hear something go by that I think, oh, that would be a really good melody for, whether I just love the melody or it's for a really particular purpose, wow, you don't hear that kind of octatonic line all that often, or a big arpeggiated Neapolitan or something like that. Just quick jot that down, and I've got a little file where it's just sort of potential 11th edition things, and I've just got these weird little jots down, and when I've got a little spare time, then I'll go through my notes. I've written just enough stuff down that I can find it, and I'll hope that it's on ImSlip or whatever, and pull this up and try to find the passage that I was hearing and just take a quick screenshot of it. So then I've got this little file of here's the things I should look through. Now the truth is, when the edition comes around, I will look at a large number of these as well and say can I justify adding pages? Because that makes the book more expensive. Is it really worth the expense to do this? What can I cut out? I don't want to cut out something that I think is better than what I might be putting in. And so I make hard choices. And there's times where I spent a lot of time finding this one. It's not as good as the ones that are there already. And I think it's probably full enough, and let it go. But other times I look at it this one is actually, I think, more easily singable than this other one. Or it's simply more different from the other ones around it. It's just a different kind of context. So yeah, that's how I don't know that that tells you any kind of secret. I mean, truly, the secret is just an awful lot of time and patience. There is no great secret. But the advantage of having the melodies from many sources, you can make. I'm not saying that there is no point to having things that are author composed. I mean, if you've got an unusual feature of a seventh leap or something, you can make something that is etude-like and plugs that in over and over to really drill it. And there is absolutely a place in the world for that. I got no problem with that. I don't do that sort of thing, or at least I haven't done that sort of thing, because the identity of the book is very much tied up with being real music. And until I hear a lot of users saying, I think that it would be nice to have just a few concentrated ones like that per chapter, not enough to change the tone of the book, but work that in, I would be glad to do it. But, until there is a groundswell of support, I don't want people to say, oh, you've sold out the aesthetic of the book. Well, there are people who are very, very devoted to this. And believe me, when I make changes, I do get a lot of unpleasant email from people. Well, I try to tell myself, I'm not saying it's never fun to get, nasty grams, right? But it just means that they care a lot about the book, and I try to take it in that spirit. I also care a lot about the book. So, so there's a place in the world for that, and I'm not precluding doing it at some point in the future if there was a lot of support, but I have not heard enough of that to feel like I want to make that change, even though I personally am not opposed to a small number of them. But there's an enormous advantage, I think, in having lots and lots of composers contributing to the collection, because when it's just one person or even 10 co-authors, you're still going to have formulas that person tends to produce. I know that if I wrote sight singing melodies, they would sound kind of all alike, or at least they would fall into a few different things. I'd create my own cliches, and that's not good. That's not giving people a variety of what's out there in the world and what is unpredictable and so forth. And so I think that getting different musical styles, whether it's folk music, concert music, instrumental music or vocal music, you name it, there's a lot of different idioms that exist, and different composers have different ways of going about it, and I just think you lose that. And if the sight singing becomes really comfortable just because it's so formulaic, well, you're not doing your students a big service, I think. So that I think is the best answer for why all the effort and time is worth it.
Absolutely. I mean, your students who think it's easier have never written an exam clearly, because when you're trying to write an exam where you're like, oh, I just need a Neapolitan that does this, you spend like 16 hours looking for one, and at some point you're like, I'll just write it myself. You give up, So it's, if you ever did write, little etude like exercises like you said, that would probably take you like half an hour versus hunting down examples like that, for sure.
Yeah. We've all had that for, as you say, writing an exam, and I don't care if we're talking about sight singing or anything. You write an exam, you say, oh, I want a nice musical excerpt, and this one's absolutely perfect. Well, except for the secondary dominant that sneaked in there, and we haven't done anything like that. Like, well, yeah, exactly. Or the cadential 6/4, like, we haven't gotten to that yet. Like, I realize you can write a big asterisk and say, oh, pay no attention to the chord in measure 7, but you don't want to do that, and certainly that's not going to work for sight singing. So, part of I would feel deep shame if I ever got mail saying, hey, you've got this feature that you haven't introduced that somehow sneaked into an early chapter. I try to be really vigilant about that, because everyone is under time pressure, and I want to have a book that is reliable, so that if you don't have time to read through everything, that you can have faith that if these melodies say that there's no dotted rhythms in there, and there's no chromaticism, whatever you haven't gotten to yet, that they are not going to surprise you by popping up. I want to be that reliable book. I don't have a lot of patience for books that like, hey, where'd that come from? Nope, not going to be me.
My thought was, when you were talking about the exercise at the beginning of the chapter that would focus on perhaps a certain interval, somebody a while back had asked me for private sight singing lessons, and I thought, I don't know even what to do. But they brought their own book, and it was this text modus novus or something. And it was like that. It was at the very beginning, it was all these intervals, and I thought, well, certainly, my first thought was, well, certainly we need to mix this with literature. So it ended up being the first lesson was the modus novus for the whole lesson, but then every subsequent lesson was, maybe 5 to 10 minutes of the modus novus, and then applied in the context of literature examples, because I thought that's just more useful. So I really like the way you've considered that and weighed that. Yeah.
It's a venerable book, to be sure, but it's hard. That is hard going. Yeah.
Yes. If you can sing that, I mean, the literature part should be easier, quote unquote. I'm doing air quotes there for those just listening. Yeah, it should be easier if you can do it, and it's a great way to kind of set up. If you have one thing you want to target, of course, you can turn to the section of modus novus that you want to focus on. But ultimately, it's about the literature, and I've always loved that part of the Ottman-Rogers book, that it's so literature focused. So kudos for finding all those great music examples.
Well, thanks. It helps that there's, of course, a lot of great music out there. But, it's the sorting. That is hard.
So what would you want someone teaching aural skills for the first time to know about sight singing? Someone who's maybe a TF, or maybe even just maybe an adjunct faculty or a faculty member who maybe their main area isn't theory and aural skills. Maybe they're the trombone professor, but they're going to be teaching aural skills for their university. What's something that, what are some things that you would want them to know about sight singing?
Yeah, this is by no means a unique thought. But, when we perform music, we don't just think note to note. And so let's not start approaching sight singing from note to note. That is not the way that, you, new teacher, are sight singing. And it's not going to help if you encourage your students to work that way, that it's always left to right and you're just doing interval to interval to interval. Again, I'm realizing I'm waving my hands around. That's not helping. But if you're actually just, thinking about the interval between any given pair of notes and then performing that, you're working too hard, and it's not a musical way to approach it. So I really recommend practicing basic skills that foster other larger, more holistic approaches. So, for instance, given a well-established key, can students pull scale degrees out of thin air? Because that is going to be more helpful right there. Would it make sense to be thinking harmonically and really conjure up the sound of, say, the dominant seventh chord in your mind to get through this particular measure with its leaps? If, for that matter, if there are lots and lots of big leaps, could you orient your thinking around a high line and a low line, what I and many people would call a compound melody, the idea that you've got a melody, but it seems to be implying more than one voice at a time. And very often, the sort of upper line that's going along, think of this as like yodeling, for instance. There's an upper line, there's a lower line, and they, in fact, are very coherent and moving in a stepwise way. It's just those big leaps between them. And so if you can see and hear the upper melody and the lower melody and just see yourself as kind of ping-ponging back and forth between them, it's a lot easier to think about. You're not thinking about the large leaps, you're thinking about the stepwise motion, you're just getting between them. So I really would suggest talking about ways to get the notes when there's a big leap. How could we think about this? And there may be multiple approaches, like if a student says, well, it's actually the same high note that I sang a measure earlier, and that one I got to by step. Great, you don't have to think note to note. Go back to some sort of landmark that has made an impression on your memory. These musically salient notes will be useful. Again, lots of techniques for doing that, but that would be like my number one message, I think, of not thinking note to note. I would also give somebody a practical little tip, because probably all of us as beginners had this experience of students who, they all got different voice ranges, and you don't know what key is appropriate for them. So, you pick a key and it turns out it's really high or really low for them, and they stop partway through because it's uncomfortable, or things like this happen. Or for that matter, even if you went to the trouble to test everybody's voice range and dutifully write it down and figure out what a good key for them is going to be, well, maybe they got a little bit of a cold, they were up late the night before, or or it's early in the morning, whatever it is. The key is not necessarily what you think it is at any given time. I strongly recommend having students establish their own key, and that being part of the ritual of sight singing. I have had students, they just memorize, and at first it's just memorizing this little pattern. You'll recognize that it's giving you some harmonic elements, but I have them sing. Step one is you look at the melody, and I'm going to misuse a couple words here, but most melodies are organized either around an octave that's basically sort of tonic to tonic, and we might think of those as being sort of authentic melodies, or they're kind of more, shall we say, plagal melodies, where it's like, well, the tonic's kind of in the middle, and it maybe goes down to the scale degree 5 and up to scale degree 5, but it is basically probably two kind of ranges that are going to work like that. And so if they thought that it was one of these, shall we say, plagal ranges where the tonic's kind of in the middle, they would sing in whatever fit their voice. They look at it and say, okay, it's one of those where we have a low so. And so they go, do, mi, sol, la, sol, fa, re, ti, do, sol, mi, do. And so they've got, they establish their own key. Rather than me giving them the key, they have done the key. They, I think, have the key more solidly in their mind after doing it. We aren't fussing about what the range is. And if the range is authentic, then instead of having the low so, there's go sol mi do at the end. Same basic pattern. But I find that they hold their key much better. We don't do that sort of negotiating about where you get, oh, I'm sorry, it's a little high for me. Can I start over? Like, no, can't start over. So it's, you can think about it as the excuse buster, but I think it's got a lot of practical benefits. So that's just sort of a little tip. I wonder if you would mind if I branch out to people who are not just first-time teachers, but maybe they've been TAs before and they've graduated, and this is their first time running an Aural Skills program. Because there's things that are important about that too. I strongly recommend, if you are doing this on your own for the first time, you have not just inherited somebody else's syllabus, or at least you have the flexibility to do what you want now. Think about your really big picture decisions, like your policies for attendance and for homework, things like that. Because I strongly recommend making it obviously better to the student, that it is better for a student to come to class unprepared rather than not coming at all. I mean, of course we want the students to come prepared, but if they didn't do their homework and they realize, oh, I haven't sung any of these melodies that I was supposed to do for homework, wouldn't we all rather have them show up and like, yeah, I really can't sing that very well, versus just staying home? You're just compounding the problem. You're making it so much worse. So make sure that you have done something to make it always a better gamble to come to class unprepared. Like, all right, it may be a little bit embarrassing, but it sure beats sticking my head in the sand and not doing anything, right? Other kinds of things to consider are like, what is your balance of prepared singing, like that homework I just mentioned, versus true sight singing, or the weighting of daily work versus exams. You know, there's a lot of big picture things. Now, obviously, I realize that the goal is having the aural skills to engage with completely unfamiliar music when you need to, but at the same time, we have to realize, just as human beings, that some students become very anxious when they feel out of control of a situation. And, you know, we will never have the opportunity to hear those students at their best if they're desperately afraid of failure all the time. So, you know, it's an individual decision. I'm not saying that I've got the right answer. I don't have a corner on truth here. And I also know that, you know, it's going to vary from program to program, and I don't know your students. I'm not going to presume to say what's good for them, but, you know, I'm going to trust your judgment on this to come to your own independent conclusion. But for me, I have enough prepared material that is going to be 60% of the exam, so that I can tell people, like, look, if you do these melodies, these rhythms, you know, whatever it is that you're coming in, that you know I'm going to choose one of these 20 melodies, and you prepare them, you know you're going to pass. You're guaranteed to pass. It's 60%. You know, you memorize it if you have to, if that's the way you want to approach things. You know, that's up to you. I'm not saying I recommend that, but, you know, if they are that anxious, you can do whatever you want, and you got 60%. And as for the rest of it, does that mean like, oh, I'm going to get a D minus? No, because what do you think, even if you have a bad day, on your worst day, do you think you truly score a 0 in rhythm, reading, or sight singing? No, of course not.
Right.
I mean, a disaster would be, geez, I missed half of it. Well, you know, that's 50%. That's going to be an 80 right there, right? You know, and I bet it's better than that. So when they walk in realizing, like, I am in control, I have prepared, and of course the things that I ask them to sight read are hitting the same kinds of features, whether it's, you know, an arpeggiated dominant seventh chord or whatever, you know, they are prepared for it. It goes fine, and I have a lot less problem with, I mean, the students, geez, you feel so bad for them. They're hyperventilating as they even walk into your office and tearing up, and, you know, it's traumatic for them. And I don't want to, I'm not looking to make anybody feel like that. So, you know, obviously, it's not going to solve anxiety for everyone, because, you know, test anxiety is a thing, but hopefully it reduces it, and hopefully it means that I see what they really can do, rather than just, you know, something that's more evidence of their nerves than all the work they've put in and their musical abilities. So, you know, I'd ask for anybody who is starting out a program to think about these big picture things and the practical effect that they are going to have on the way the whole course goes, the way your students will behave, what they will prioritize, how much they will prepare. If it's hopeless, they're not going to practice. If it's too easy, they're not going to practice. You know, that get that Goldilocks kind of area. And actually, speaking of the Goldilocks kind of thing, no matter what you're teaching, I don't care if it's aural skills or written skills or anything else, you need to focus on setting achievable goals on a time frame that is reasonable for a freshman who's like leaving home for the first time. So, you know, I tend to think in week-long units, because if you say, oh, we need you to do this in 3 months, they're going to procrastinate. You know, I'm sure I would too. I'm not pointing fingers here. And if you need to achieve this goal an hour from now, that's not enough time to practice. A week is usually about right. They can manage their time for a week. And so you set this achievable goal, be really clear what it is, provide lots of feedback during that time, whether it's a practice exam or whatever it is, lots of feedback so students know where they stand relative to your expectations. And if you set the bar within that Goldilocks zone where it is achievable, if they just work a little bit, they will make steady progress, and and that's the most important thing, not you being amazed how much progress they make. They will be amazed, I think, at, wow, when I did this, it was not that hard, and look at how far I've come compared to where I was in August or September. And, that's actually one of the great things about teaching any introductory course, but I think introductory sight singing especially, because that initial learning curve, it scares people, but they really take off. At least that has been my experience, and it's really satisfying. And sophomore years may be harder, but that's sort of the good news. You can get beginners feeling pretty good about it with not that much effort, I think.
Yeah, I'm teaching Aural Skills 1 this fall for the first time in a long time, and it's actually one of my favorite classes to teach, and I'm so excited to have it back. I make our schedule myself, so I don't know how it's happened that I haven't done it in a while. It's on me, but I'm thrilled to have it back. But as I was actually writing a Pedagogy of Theory online class in the spring, and so I was reading through, lots of articles. I read Gary Karpinski's book again, and then of course we were at the workshops together this summer. And I have been a long-time proponent of no, Aural Skills is for training sight skills. Why are we doing prepared singing? And I will say Gary's book and the sessions this summer have changed my mind. And he argues that it's different skills, and that they need to be able to practice both of those skills, both the skill of performance and preparedness, right? Yeah. And the skill of reading something at sight, and they need both to be successful. I totally agree. Yeah. So I've actually changed my syllabus, my structure, based on what we talked about in Vancouver and what I read in his book this past spring. But speaking of Vancouver, you were there, you were one of the clinicians, and one of my favorite sessions was when you played some very particular bass lines and got us all to sing the exact same response. And it was, even though we knew what you were getting at, it was one of those great moments of we all sang exactly the same thing. She set us up for total success. So you talked a lot about how, our students already know inherently a lot about music. And a lot of what we're doing is providing names for that and revealing that understanding that they already have. So could you talk a little bit more about that, how you use that idea in your classroom?
Yeah, like you were saying, the students, even without a lot of formal training, they've internalized an enormous amount of information about musical style, at least by ear. And they don't know how much they know. They probably can't articulate much of what they know, let alone represent it in standard notation. But that's sort of our job to help them get there. But we got to keep in mind, they're not blank slates. That is not what's going on. So for me, it's useful and fun to have students show me and show themselves what they know. So like you're describing, I will set up common patterns and ask the students of the class as a whole to simply sing what comes next. And I'm of course stacking the deck unabashedly. I really am pushing those buttons for particular patterns, but that's the point. The pattern is the point here. So I will set up a pattern, and pretty reliably they will all sing the same thing without even thinking about it. If they don't sing the same thing, then probably it's because I have failed, not about them. And even if they don't, and I've done a good job setting it up, it means that they don't know that particular pattern, and at least now I know that. But most of the time they do exactly what I think they're going to do. It could be as simple as playing a melody or even a scale that ends on the leading tone, and anybody who grew up in this culture will resolve the leading tone to the tonic. We just know that. And just reacting by ear, students will resolve chordal sevenths down, that sort of thing. They might not do it in their written work, but by ear, they know it goes down, right? They will nicely demonstrate the different behavior in a minor key between the low form of scale degree 6 and the raised form. So, lay versus la for people using do bass minor. I can give other sort of patterns, like if I set up a 2/6 chord, if I'm doing predominance, I set up a 2/6 chord with Ray, scale degree 2 in the melody, they will sing the most characteristic voice leading pattern. So, if I've done something that goes like from 1 to 1/6, 2/6, and then it's going to 5 to 1, so my bass line's going 1, 3, 4, 5, 1. And if they have started off writing a melody, and they go, let's start off with 3, 1, 2, and we've got that much on the board, and I say, don't reason this through. When you go 3, 1, 2, what comes next? And they all go 7, 1. That's what ought to happen. And yes, when you have a 2/6 chord with scale degree 2 in the melody, chances are it's going down to the leading tone. And it is, especially in a minor key, it's going to make things a whole lot easier. So the demonstration that you saw me do was cadential 6/4. I have my whole bag of tricks that I do, but because this is not just related to single notes. I'm trying to think what else I did in Vancouver.
We did one where we all sang the same consequent, pretty much.
Right. I do cadential 6/4. I also did the singing a phrase in sentence structure and then expanding it into a parallel period. You can get people to do all kinds of things like this. I love approaching new topics that way because it shows the students how much they know. And importantly, when a whole class responds in unison, I think it's pretty compelling evidence that whatever we're discussing must be pretty common and therefore pretty important in that way of being, ubiquitous. As I often say to my students when we get there, we're not resolving this way because I say so or because our textbook says so. We're doing it because your ears say so. That's why you did it that way. And you all agreed on this. This has got to be a real thing. And to be clear, although my focus in my courses is classical music, it is certainly not restricted to classical music. I'm totally sure you play a pretty formulaic pop song and stop it a little bit before the chorus and ask your students what's going to come next. They know it's the chorus, and they can tell you when it's going to start, right? It's going to be right about here. Now, of course, we all know that sometimes common patterns are broken. Maybe the chorus arrives a measure late and keeps us hanging on in anticipation, or maybe there's a deceptive cadence instead of an authentic cadence. Things happen. But it's fun to be tricked now and then, and we can't enjoy that if we don't have expectations. There's literally no such thing as a surprise for somebody who has no sense of what would come next. So... these patterns are really a big thing. And, another thing that I want students to absorb from approaching topics by ear is that their written work should also always involve their ears. Part writing, for instance, is not just moving dots around the page. If you aren't actively thinking about the sounds that those dots represent, you're going to make mistakes. By ear, they will resolve the leading tone up. They'll remember to raise it in a minor key. They'll take sevenths down. But on paper, no, we all know that these things, are not necessarily done correctly. But by ear, they wouldn't do it. So if you think about how it sounds, you're not going to make these basic mistakes. Certainly, if you analyze music without listening to it, you are inviting disaster. You are going to make mistakes. And they're going to be embarrassing mistakes when you do listen to that music. So students, after a while, began to realize that when I only comment about something, I circle and measure and say, did you listen to this? That it is really a question. Did you listen to this? Because they hear it and they're like, oh, no, that is not what I meant. Like, I was pretty sure. So, I think that when you, I give another sort of method, because I've been talking about having people sing things back in general, but you can also very often tap into that baked-in musical knowledge without making students actually sing. When you're doing subtle aspects of style, you can say, let me play you 2 choices. Which one sounds a little better to you? And you can do very fine details like, does this passage sound better with 5, 6, 5 of 5? Or 7, 7 of 5, the secondary dominant or the secondary leading tone chord. And, if you just say, does this sound okay or does this sound bad, they both sound fine. But when you say, forced choice, got to pick one of them. The majority of them will pick the one that is more common and the one that I prefer, and then we can talk about why. Why is that better? And by the way, in situations like that, I also often love to have a ringer, something that nobody would write. So, if I'm in a minor key, I might do the 5, 6, 5 of 5, the fully diminished 7, 7 of 5. If you play the same pattern with 7 half diminished 7 of 5, it's garbage. It's disgusting. And students, they burst out laughing and they say, you're right to laugh. No one would do that. That is musically bad. Why is that so bad? So now we can put it on the board or the projector or whatever. What's bad about that? And now we're really doing music theory. Okay, I know I like this better. Why? There must be a reason. And, they can propose all kinds of things. And if they say, for instance, like, oh, well, that's scale degree 3, and that's really characteristic in the minor mode, so we shouldn't be raising it. It sounds like major. And I say, oh, but what if I'm in a major key and I use fully diminished 7, 7 to 5? Same thing, me to may instead of may to me. How's that sound? Like, oh, well, that one's okay. So, I'm not saying it's not relevant, but that can't be the full story. And, you can get people to come up with like, wait, that's a 7th, it wants to go down. Why would you be raising a note that wants to go down? That doesn't make musical sense. Yeah, exactly. And that, I don't care if you bury it in inner voice, it's bad. Everyone can hear that. So, there's lots of ways that you can take advantage of what people know about style and taste and this and that. And I think it's more memorable. It's certainly more fun. If you're doing nothing more than changing up what you do in class, that's good. But I think you get a lot more out of it, a lot more things other than just a little variety and fun.
Yeah.
No, I love that. I love making the students the authority almost.
Yeah.
Like unknowingly, right? Like they already know what sounds good. They're not blank slates. And that kind of revelation that they get when they're like, oh, the thing that I've known for like my whole life, now I have a word to describe it, or a sound that connects the language. It's amazing. Well, Nancy, we promised we'd only talk to you for an hour.
Oh my gosh, I haven't even been watching the time. It's just been so much fun talking to you.
This has been such a blast. We have had such a good time. And for those of you who are listening, wonder where Ben has been. He's been fighting like the Zoom zombies because he's been going in and out.
Getting kicked off the internet repeatedly today.
So he's just been popping up randomly. So that's why if you've been wanting to hear more of Ben, he's not been with us, but he'll be back. Don't worry, he hasn't been replaced. But before we let you go, we do like to ask our guests some quick rapid fire questions. So these are just kind of little one-off hot takes on just questions. A question that I'll come up with and Jenn will come up with. Okay. And maybe I'll come up with another one for Ben. Because I have. Okay, so I'll this is Ben's, and this is just a real short one, but I always struggle with this. All right. Is sight singing 2 words or a word or a word with a hyphen in between sight and singing? What is the correct?
Oh, that's a grammar question, actually, sort of, because if it's being used as an adjective, like a sight singing textbook, then you hyphenate it. But if you say, I've been practicing my sight singing, then you would not hyphenate it.
There you go. Someone with a linguistics degree answered the question. All right, Jenn, what's your hot take? I need to think of another one.
Well, this is kind of cheating because I already know the answer, but 164 or 564?
Oh, yeah, it's a 5. If it doesn't sound like home, that's no 1 chord.
All right, and the last one, since this has been about sight singing, this conversation, what your favorite kind of solfege syllables? Minor do, minor la, numbers, something else. What do you prefer?
Yeah. I will, as I always say to my students, that, if the teacher is really committed to a system, they will make that work. Okay. So, other people can be committed to other things and it depends on context, but I personally have a pretty strong preference for solfege with do-based minor. I like the movable do solfege. I certainly want a movable system. That is my primary method of doing things. For people who want a fixed system, and there's absolutely value in having a fixed system, I think in addition to a movable system, I say for Americans, why use fixed do solfege? I mean, for Europeans, sure, that's what they've grown up with. But, we use fixed letter names, so why not use letter names if you want a fixed system? I don't see any reason to learn a whole new system for that. I totally understand wanting to use numbers if you have lots of students from countries where their note names are solfege syllables because, that's very hard on them. And so I understand when you have a very international student body that numbers are probably the way to go. But if I'm dealing with people with more or less my background, I really like do-based minor movable solfege. Yeah.
That's great. So as we're wrapping up, maybe you can just let our listeners know where they can find you if you want to be found on the internet, and maybe what else you might have cooking in addition to, you know, the what sounds like maybe a curse of having to always be listening for new musical examples for the next edition. But I'm like, is that a blessing or a curse to always be, you know, listening? But
yeah, it's for sure a weird orientation. I understand that, but yeah. All right, so I love to be found, sure, and it's pretty easy. I think if you just do, I don't do social media, so don't even bother there. But if you just want to find me online and find my email address and so forth, if you just put Nancy Rogers, and that's Rogers, there's no D in there, and music theory, because it's a really common name. But if you put Nancy Rogers and music theory, I will pop up pretty close to the top of your search, I think. My research these days has been focused a lot on correlations between music theory ability and mathematical ability. Mm-hmm. And because a lot of people have over the years noticed, and when I say the years, I mean the ancient Greeks talked about this, right? But you know, those of us in more modern times, I'm guessing that you have probably, and many listeners have probably had the experience of a student showing up in your office and, you know, you're giving an explanation for something that seems pretty straightforward and not very mathy, like, you know, key signatures or how to make major triads or something. And suddenly they look at you with this deer in the headlights look and say, oh, this is just like math. I really don't like math. I'm not good at math. The minute, and like, I'm thinking that what's mathy about this at all? But the minute that a student expresses anxiety or antipathy towards math, I think, oh, this is going to be hard for you. I don't know why, but music theory is going to be hard for you. With my work over the years, what I've come to the conclusion is that it's not a causal relationship like studying music theory doesn't make you better at math or studying math doesn't make you better at music theory, but that instead it seems that both of these areas are very positively impacted by good pattern recognition. There may be other elements too, like having abstract symbols feel very meaningful to you. That would obviously be beneficial for both kind of areas. But I have shown and ended up developing a really really out of the box placement test. Frankly, it came out of an experiment that I was doing that I realized, because it was about basically tests that predict how well students will do in college calculus versus, predicting their performance in calculus. And there's a variety of them, like, you know, looking at a bunch of different shapes and saying, well, which one of these shapes seems not to be like the others and that kind of thing. And I'll use that one as an easy example, like 5 of the shapes are symmetrical and the last one isn't. And for people who randomly pick and don't seem to understand, like, no, symmetry is a thing without being told, don't notice that is kind of the principle being exhibited there, they don't do well in calculus, and they don't do well in music theory either. And I look at things like that and say, like, wow, who could miss this? And the answer is, well, somebody who doesn't do well in music theory, right? So the pattern recognition seems to be very much what it's about. And so I am branching out from there about sort of ways that we can quickly tap into pattern recognition, and in the short term, this is helping me make a placement test that, we've been using now for years. It works pretty effectively, that it will show people's apparent aptitude for music theory rather than just their achievement for music theory, which is really great because nobody wants to start with a remedial class. You don't need more credits in your degree. Maybe your scholarship didn't cover this. There's a lot of reasons to avoid remedial classes. And so somebody who simply hasn't learned this stuff but is really ready to go, I want those person in Theory 1 if I can do it. And this test seems to identify people who can do that. Now, every semester, when I put in people who are like, wow, this person doesn't have the background, does not read music well, I am sweating bullets that I have doomed this person to failure. But they have done okay, as long as they show up to class and turn in their homework. If they don't do that the responsibility is on them. But it has worked. So, my short term is like, well, can I tweak this test and make it, better and better, better? But long term, and this is truly an open question, when we identify people who seem to have like a math disability that seems to be impacting their theory ability, and if they really struggle to get through classes, would it be possible to focus on exercises with pattern recognition? And so rather than teaching music theory directly, if we practice pattern recognition, could they maybe get better at music theory? Now, I don't know. Maybe that works, maybe that doesn't. It would require a kind of a longitudinal study and a lot of resources to do it, resources that I do not currently have. But that is my dream, that not only can I just identify like, wow, I think music theory is going to be hard for this little group of students, but that I can actually help them rather than just saying like, oh, too bad for you, because nobody wants that. We want to be able to actually help them out and find some alternative strategy. But I'm not there yet, but that's the long-term dream.
You just made it to the end of another episode of Note Doctors, the music theory and pedagogy podcast. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and review the podcast, and you can always reach us at notedoctorspodcast@gmail.com with comments, questions, or show ideas. Thanks for listening.